We're starting off here with a picture of the Thames, right at the very beginning of the gold rush. Here it says 1868. A few houses have been built. Whoops. But in fact, when the miners arrived 1st of August 1867, there was only this building, and it was a trading post where you could get stores from, and it had been there for quite some time. But there was no wharf, of course. There was just the sandy beach, which is about all we've got today. And you could only approach the beach with a dinghy or a flat bottom, something, a small boat. So all the big boats and yachts had to stay out here in the bay, and everything had to be transferred into small boats and brought ashore. Well, they arrived on 1st of August 1867, 50 miners and the gold warden, James Mackay. And it was late at night, about 6 o'clock at night. They'd been held up by a storm, and the storm was still raging, wind, rain. So most of the miners stayed on deck and slept the night on the boat. And early next morning, on the 2nd of August, they all started to transfer their goods and chattels onto the beach. So that was the beginning of the rush. In fact, this is another picture of Thames, taken about at the end of 1867, beginning of 1868. And you can see the beginnings of the Thames township here. They called it the Thames, of course, because they meant the Thames River. This is not the Thames River, this is Kairanga. The Thames River was further over, and today, of course, we call it the Waiau. So the only thing that's now called the Thames, and the Thames was named by Captain Cook, of course, and the only thing that's now called the Thames is the town. It started to grow, but this area, the most of Thames was swamp. It was low-lying flats, and they couldn't camp on it much. But here we see the township starting to grow. First thing they did was, this is the old trading post, still here. First thing they did was turn it into a pub, and it's still a pub, it's still there. But in the hills, you can see in the background, so you go across the mud flats or the swamps, and you ended up in the hills. They pretty soon turned the town into a shanty town once the miners had got set up. And this photo, I think, is the earliest photo I've been able to find of taken in Thames, 1867. The miners are congregating around the store, and they had their butchers. Inevitably, the butcher was the most important person. You couldn't buy vegetables, really, very few, and those that you could buy were expensive. So they just lived on bacon and whatever they could buy fresh. They brought the cattle and sheep in by boat and slaughtered them as they needed them. Hung them up there in the butcher shops. That's how they all did it. You have to hope the dogs don't take a swipe at it on the way past, but I suspect they did. Now, because it was so swampy, the gold warden suggested everybody went up and camped at the foot of the hills where it was drier. Actually, he wanted them out of the way because he wanted to survey the new streets. This is the standard issue gold miners' tent. Everybody had them, same size, same shape. I guess that's what had been imported by one of the big importing companies in Auckland, and so everybody looked like they had the same thing. And you can see the hills up behind. This is now called Mount Pleasant. And right here in the background, we see the Karaka Creek, which is just behind the town today. And in fact, that was where they first all started there, because it was so close to where they had just landed. If you didn't have a tent or couldn't afford one, you could get a raupo wari made. Local Maori were quite happy to take a fee for making lots of these waris, and they were very successful, in fact, with a chimney often in corrugated iron or wood stuck on the side for all their cooking. So here's a map of Thames, and I want to point out the special area, as it was called. They were restricted, these miners. They could not go just any old where due to leases with the landowners, Maori landowners. They could start here at the Hape, which is where, if anybody knows Thames, it's where the Thames Cemetery is today. And they could go up the Karaka, which is where the Thames Hospital is today. The Waiatahi, called Waiatai locally, if you know that name. Moanataiari stream here. And then they could go as far as Kuranui Bay, which is here and up here. This is a much smaller, didn't really have much of a creek that you could call a creek. That and 2 miles back into the hills was a special area, and they were restricted to that. That was fine for the first few weeks, but there was a lot of controversy after that. The miners always felt like the grass was greener on the other side of the hill. So here we are at the very beginning of the gold rush, people still in tents, and this is the base of Karaka Creek. The Thames Hospital today is in this bottom right-hand corner. A lot of houses, little cottages being built. Right here at the base of the Karaka Creek was where they built a whole lot of batteries. And on the whole, these permanent houses are probably battery managers and such. But this is just looking the other way. We're still standing more or less by the hospital, today's site of the hospital. So we're looking at the hill on the right-hand side of the Karaka Creek in about 1868. So we've got a nice big battery built here. There's 2 or 3 more up the creek, just a little 100 yards up the creek. You can't see here. By 1869, they had these tramways going. So it dates this to more like beginning of 1869. You can see that this is being run by water power, this battery, but it's also got steam coming out the chimney. What they did was they used water power when there was plenty of water in the winter, but when it dried up, they would move to their steam engine, which to run the battery, and it was more expensive, so they preferred not to use it, unless they had to. The government made these tramways up all the creeks in order to get these batteries way up. And by then they were up 10 miles up some of the creeks, and they needed to get batteries up there, and they could not carry them up that high, those steep hills, using horses or oxen. It was just too steep. So these, and then of course they needed to bring the quartz down to the battery. But you can see there were a lot of claims way up here on the top of the hill, and they're bringing their quartz down in wagons. You can see the tracks, very deeply indented due to the mud. Must have been really dangerous to be bringing tons of quartz down. Usually they put 1 ton in a cartload, and down they would come. There were more up here, even bigger mines up here, and that you can see here the evidence of a chute coming down the hill, so they could just throw the quartz down there. They'd offload it there, take it down across and down into the next chute, and then there's a bit of a tramway that brings it. It's a double tramway, what they called in those days an incline. So they've got a steam engine here, and that is more of a brake than anything else, just to let the quartz down and into the battery. But that was an essential part of this whole process. You had to be able to get your quartz to a battery to pulverize it and get the gold out. Take a look at that on there, a cliff face. Well, here we are today. This cliff face is right there. This is a photograph taken in Thames just recently. The native bush didn't really come back. There was karri, rimu, everything is in here, but it's not anymore. We've got mostly privet and scrub, but at least it's green. It's no longer just like what you saw, mud. Oh, here we go. Okay, so this is an early map, 1867, so a little bit earlier than that last photograph I was showing you. You can, each of these names is a different claim. Eaton's, there's Eaton's battery. He built his battery down on the flat because it's easier than trying to get it up there, and he probably shoots his quartz down to that battery. Germans, Napoleon's, Garrytown. So this is the cliff on the other side of the Karaka Creek. And this is the Karaka Creek today, just to show you that it's not exactly a very big creek. And it's not very surprising that it used to run out of water in the summer. But steep on each side, they built a track up the creek. The miners did themselves. The government in the early days did not participate in any of this. They wanted a track up the creek to take their equipment and stamper batteries up there and bring their quartz down. They had to pull their labour together and build the track themselves. There was no gravel, no effort to put gravel on it, so in the winter it turned to mud and everything came to a halt. But that track is still there. It's a tramping track now. Very interesting. Starts just up from the up Karaka Road by the hospital. This is Karaka Creek today, and just to show you how steep the cliffs were on each side, but that's where they found the gold, up each side here, inside those mountains. There was no gold to speak of. Those of you who come from the South Island, there was no gold in the creek. It was all tied up in quartz reefs in these hills. They at first, some people came from Hokitika hoping to get some gold out of the sand in the rivers, but it didn't work out that way. We don't have it here at Thames to speak of. So what they had to do instead was to burrow into the hills all around Thames, just like this, go up the creek, find a likely looking spot, as they called it, and make a claim and start digging. All they had to dig with was a pick, and this is an old pick out of the bush. There's lots of them lying up in the bush, and the archaeologists ask you to leave them there. This one is still there, and here's a shovel. Notice picking up rock with a shovel is very hard on the edge of it, and that's what's happened in this one. So what they really when they went up into those hills, they were looking for outcrops of quartz, and it was shiny, as opposed to that crumbly looking stuff we've just been looking at. When they saw an outcrop of quartz like this, they went straight in. That was it. They would stake their claim around this outcrop of quartz, and this would have been an ideal place. They would have, you have to put in 4 stakes on the 4 corners of your claim, and your claim is 100 feet by 50 feet. And if you got together with some mates, say 6 of you could combine your allowance, and then it would be 600 feet by 50 feet. And 600 feet is roughly 200 meters. So quite a big patch of land for 6 people to work on. And really all they wanted to do was be able to get inside the mountain. When they found a outcrop of quartz like this, I mean, they felt like they had done their job. And you can see here the rusty iron seam that's in the quartz, that it was always, in Thames anyway, a sign that there's gold here. You can see another one here, and you can see that the water coming out of the mine, even today, is all rusty coloured. You can't see much of it, but just about all these holes in the hills have got water coming out of them, and it's rusty like that. You can be sure that this quartz that's left behind did not hold any gold in it, because they would have tested it. You test it by pulverizing a little sample yourself with a hammer or something, and you can soon pick up and see if there's any gold in it. They would have taken all of this if they'd have thought it had gold in it, but just because it didn't have gold on the outside, didn't mean to say it didn't have gold further down in the reef. And that was what was on their mind when they started building this hole, tunnel. Actually, they called it driving on the reef. That was their words for it. They found a reef they hoped would have gold, and they would drive on it with a drive. They didn't call it a tunnel, they called it a drive. Here's a quartz reef running in ordinary rock. So they call this country rock. You get a quartz reef like that, white one, which is typical of what you would find in Thames, either white or red colour, like I was saying, and you would test it, and you would burrow into it and keep going no matter how long it took. And even a small one like this gave them a lot of excitement, because it usually led to a bigger one. If you followed it, you'd find it was a branch of a bigger one. And of course, here you can see the thing that would excite everybody, and that is a quartz reef which has what they called gold able to be seen in the reef. Very exciting. So of course they'd take all of that and take it to the battery, and they'd made their fortune. But there were some of these types of ones with gold visible in the reef in Thames. Not that many. The vast majority of the quartz just looked like this, but it could look like that and it would still have gold in it if you pulverized it up. Usually about 1 ounce of gold for every ton of rock, quartz rock, average. You could sometimes get 3 ounces, and that was what we'd call a payable mine. If you can get 3 ounces a ton, you can earn, 6 of you can earn a living wage, and that's what they were looking for. Of course, any more than 3 ounces a ton, and you've made your fortune. Here's one more outcrop, and because I like it because it's got so much of the iron veins in it. This tunnel, and these are all tunnels, by the way, that you can just walk around the hills of Thames and find. I've photographed them. It's tall, and you think to yourself, why is it so tall? Surely they're not giants. What it is they're putting in tramways, and they're using a horse to get the tramway full of rock out. Especially if it's uphill, it became very, very hard to push it uphill inside the mine. So a horse was very valuable to them. So they would have to extend their tunnel up much higher for a horse. And here's the men that are actually doing it. He's got a shovel, he's got his pick, and that's it. That's all they've got to do it with. They used a lot of timber inside the mine. Oh, the next slide will show that better. And notice the tramway coming out. And this is a tall mine, so they no doubt had a horse pulling that out. You know, if they were using a horse, because they made this here into a path in between the rails. It was a nice flat path for the horse to step on. Here's another one where you can see the timbering that they needed to put into the mine in order to hold up the roof. And there was that timber went all the way through the mine, and depending on if it's crumbly or not. And you've got to be careful about when you find one of these tunnels up behind Thames, you go in there, but remember the timbering has now gone rotten. So there's nothing holding those roofs up. And the slightest movement can bring it all down on your head, so be careful. They've got a tramway, and you can see they've been doing it. They've put this pathway here for them. Here they all are. I don't know if you can see them very well here. There's a whole group of them here and here. So these ones on the left are most likely the owners of the mine, because they're better dressed than the workers. Okay, so we're going back to Thames now. This is what they call Bird in the Hand Hill. So one of these claims was called Bird in the Hand, worth two in the bush, I suppose. They used the same sayings as we did. And this hill is right above Thames Main Street. So if you're standing in Thames, Pollen Street, you're going to look up the hills, and this is what you would have seen in 1868. And you can see the tunnels we've just been looking at going into the hills. I mean, there were tunnels all over Thames hills, everywhere. They just threw the mine waste out, threw it out here, and just going straight in. And you can see them ones, there's more up here. They've been bringing their quartz down in this track. And this track along the bottom goes to the battery, because right in the background here is Karaka Creek. And we've just been looking at all the batteries that were over there. So what they've got to do is load their quartz onto a cart, onto this track, and it'll lead them down behind today's hospital and into Karaka Creek for the batteries. So you can see here we've got a mixture of people living on a claim, either in a tent or a hut. I told you before, it was about 200 metres was a claim, and that's probably this area here. That's their claim. 200 metres by 50 feet, what's that, about 18 metres. Another claim would be here. Taking a look at this house here, I've got a close-up of it. Children and the mum is standing in the door. So it's the children and the family were living on the claim with the father who probably owned the claim. Not a safe place for two little kids like this. There's another tunnel down there, so they better not wander down here or they're going to fall in it. They better not wander out their front door because they're going to fall down that cliff. I don't know, it must be really difficult to bring up children on the goldfields. My own great-grandmother did. She had 5 children under 5 and lived on the claim with her husband too. I don't know how she lived, whether she was in a tent or a hut, but it would have been one or the other. There's the close-up view of the tunnel here, the road to the battery, and a standard issue tent. Okay, so where we've been looking, this is a photo taken from Thames, and this is the hill we've just been looking at with the Karaka Creek going up here. So what did you do once you built that first tunnel going into the side of the hill? Well, let's say this is it. This is just an example of what you're doing. You do your first drive and you go in. What you're looking for is a quartz leader or an outcrop of quartz in the rock. And you can tell that because it's shiny, hard, often with those iron leaders and stuff around. So here you go, you're trundling along. You might have gone only 5 feet. You might have gone 200 feet and you still haven't found one, but you keep going till you find one. And here's one here. So they've burrowed all around it. They know exactly what they've got, and they start pulling it out, taking the quartz out in there, maybe in a wheelbarrow at the beginning, later on in a tram, get it out and get it to the battery, maybe load it onto a horse and cart and take it down to the battery. But after a while, they run out. They go down as far as they can really manage any longer to pull up and pull out. But by now, they know that the direction this quartz reef is going. They can see when they get to here, where they've tunneled out to, that it's starting to go down, which inevitably all the quartz reefs at Thames started to go down. They would usually swing downwards like this, the ones that had gold in them. That's because the gold came up from the centre of the earth at some time, eons ago, and it would be more gold as you go down, inevitably. Very few of them didn't. Okay, so Evan, that's Stefan. Okay, so I'm trying to stop that noise. Okay, so it's going down, and what they would do, if they possibly can, they'd go further down the hill. Now, we were just looking at that big bird in the hand hill, and it went down. So they could go in here and meet that thing. They know where they needed to look because they had calculated where the best place to go into downhill was. In they go, meet it. And now it's much easier job to just pull the quartz out. They can burrow up into it, like up into here, and drop it down. And that's what they did. And of course, if they see it's still going on, well, they repeat that and level down too, if that's what they do. All of this will take a year or so. However, in some cases, they've got their first tunnel in here on the side of the hill, but down here, it could be that there's no hill there anymore, it's the flat, maybe the creek. So the only way to get further down here is to go right back up to the top of the hill on your claim and burrow down with a shaft. And that's what they did. They would go all the way down, they'd go past their first drive, down further, and then take a guess at where to go back in to meet the reef on the other side. So down they bring it, and they'd bring it out this way, because this here is no good. It's underground, so they've got to bring it out this way. And then the big job is they've got to get all their quartz up to the surface in order to take it to the battery. This is a shaft up in the hills of Thames. You have to be careful if you go walking up there, because these are not marked, not fenced, covered in grass or fern. And every step you take up in those hills, that's what's there. When there's a fire up in the hills behind Thames, the fire brigade can't go up there for fear of falling in one of these. And these can be down 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet. So you've got your life in your hands if you walk around the hills of Thames. Okay, so I was telling you they've got the big job of pulling this quartz up the shaft. And they can drive these winding machines. In this case, he's turning it by hand, but you can actually do a horse swim, as they called it, and have a horse going round in circles and doing the same job. But in this case, we've got a very early one. This guy here loaded the quartz into this bucket and brought it up the shaft. Now he has to stay out of the way. He can't stand here under the bucket, because when it gets to the top, this guy has got to maneuver that bucket out and over here to where he's standing. And during that process, it's very easy for some of the quartz to get tipped out and come back down. Or alternatively, people walking around the rim of the shaft can easily kick rocks down there. So it's not something you should ever do when you're mining, is stand under a shaft. And he didn't. He's well out of the way. There's a story in the papers here about somebody who wasn't standing out of the way. A piece of quartz hit him on the head. They took him out the shaft, loaded him on a cart, took him downtown, loaded him on the boat to go to the hospital in Auckland, but he was dead by the time they arrived. So it's a dangerous, dangerous job. If you're not falling down a shaft, you're getting hit in the head with stone, or these things can cave in. Now is working here with no timber. In most cases, they would have to have timbering here. Here's an old stamper battery. There's a lot of these up in the hills, Thames, in remote places, rusting away. The whole idea of these is you need to have this drive shaft turning. So one way or another, you've got to turn this shaft, and then the whole contraption will actually work. When it's turning, this shaft turns. It's got camshafts on here that actually raise these stampers up and down. This is the stamper box where you put the big lumps of quartz. They pulverize and come out onto, basically it's just a flat deck which catches the gold. It has riffles in it sometimes, like an ordinary one does, but mostly at Thames what they did is they threw mercury usually into the stamper box, so that by the time it came out onto this, they didn't need it to be very long, because all they had to do was collect up this mercury gold amalgam. And it was a white fluffy stuff, easy to spot when it's amongst the powdered rock. They'd pull it out, put it in a retort back at home or somewhere, not here, but take it down away, heat it up, and the mercury would vaporize. They'd collect that mercury for reuse, and sitting in the bottom of your retort would be the melted gold. They would then pour that into a mold to give them a gold bar, hopefully, or a gold coin shaped thing or something, whatever much gold they managed to get out of there. And they would take that down to the bank. Now, this is actually, what they're finding here is bullion, and it's not pure gold. It's about 30 to 40% gold. It's got a 30 to 40% silver at Thames. The bank would do an analysis of the percentage of gold and silver, and the miners would be paid the next day according to this analysis. Here's a big battery at Tauru in the hills. So this is more like about 1869, getting a bit more organised. They've managed to get all this battery machinery and that stamper battery I've just shown you up into the hills. They've also got a steam engine because they've got a chimney here. But in this case, they're using a water wheel, which you can see here, which goes round and round when the water comes. They're bringing the water in from the Tauru Creek, which must be a distance away, on this water race. The water shoots onto the top of the wheel and spins it round, just basically pushes it round. And here you can see the water that's coming out of this water wheel. Afterwards, quite a flow. So that wheel is fair spinning when there's that much water. That's how big that race is. It's bringing all that water in. And their mine must have been off here to the right, because you can see they've got a trolley path coming in here, probably also their tramway, and they pour the quartz directly into the top of the stamper battery. It goes into that stamper that I just showed you and down into the stamper boxes. They have various hoppers in there to collect it into as they tip it in, and then they can feed it into the stamper battery as they need it. So as time went by, these mines became very, very complex. And this is just to show you one at Tauru, that there was lots of them at Thames as well. They have what they call the battery level. So this is going directly into the battery at this level. So once more, they're trying to work downwards. So they've gone up here, found this dark area, which is the gold lode, and they hollow this level out here, bring the quartz into the shaft, drop it down, and load it into a tramway trolley. And they do that for the next level, then go up with shaft here again, take out the next lot, drop it down, probably have to reload it and drop it down again because it's a different level, different shape. But they can just carry on up and up until they get that all hollowed out. So basically all of that rock is now gone, that you see as the dark area. And it's pretty much the same, the whole of Thames. So when you look up to the hills above Thames, you have to imagine it's being mostly hollow. And here they are hollowing out. This is just a painting from an art gallery, because I don't think anybody ever photographed it. In those days, you didn't have flash photography, so this kind of thing could never be photographed. So we rely on artists. And you can see they've left pillars to hold the roof up, but also they would have needed a lot of timber also to hold up the roof. It's all done with candle power and also hurricane lamps, but in this case, just candle power. So you couldn't really see what you're doing in a lot of cases. Now back to Thames itself. This is a tunnel in Thames. If you go in a bit, well, I don't recommend that, my son did, and he took this photo. And what they've done here is they've hollowed it out, just like what they did in the last photo. So this must have been all gold-bearing quartz here, and it's all gone. You can see evidence of the rusty veins, as I was saying, where you're going to find gold. All these rocks here are rusty. Then this reef that they were following must have split into two. They do that often. And they followed both of them. And it's done its usual trick of swinging downwards. Both of them have swung downwards. Well, those miners will follow those reefs to the bottom center of the earth if they can. They just keep going. As long as they keep finding quartz that's got gold in it, they'll keep going. There's only one thing that stops them, and that's water. The water would eventually come up. Of course, way up in the top of the hills of Thames wasn't a whole lot of water, so they did all right. But once you get down onto the flat, or when you get down to the sea level on these hills, you're going to have water infiltration. And they did not have high-powered portable pumps, like water pumps like we have today. They were kind of stuck. Thames started up some years later, about 1870, started up what they called the big pump, which was a public pump. And it was able to help with some of the water but only close into town, not way up in the hills like this one is. Here's an aerial view of Thames in the 1960s, just to give you an idea of how close these hills are to the town, even today. They're right in it. And this is the 1960s, so you can see the bush has actually grown back by 1960. I want to point out this here. This is a tailings pile. And this was the most important Moanataiari load of gold that was ever found in Thames was there. They brought the mine waste and the tailings down in a tramway they had set up, take it right out and dump it in the sea. Well, they did that for 20, 30 years. And as a result, we've now got a landfill here. And today, this is the suburb of Moanataiari. It's been built up and consolidated and turned into a suburb. But in fact, it's starting its life as a tailings pile. And those of you who know A&G Price, that's right there. And the gold mine experience, which is a live battery where tourists can go. I highly recommend it to see a battery in action, see a mine in action, see everything. If you go to Gold Mine Experience, which is right there, it used to be the Golden Crown claim, which we'll come to later. And here's Tararoo, similar. Tararoo was an important gold mining. That big mine I just showed you, the city of Dunedin, was actually up in here along with a lot of other big mines. And this is their tailings pile, which today is also a suburb. Can't let a good tailings pile go to waste. Okay, so now we're at here's A&G Price. This is at the top corner of that aerial view we were just looking at. Anyone knows the Thames War Memorial is right there. This photograph was taken in the 1940s, 1942, and this hadn't been built more than 10 years, it's still there today. This is the Waiatahi Creek, one of the most important creeks during the gold rush. And as you can see, even in the 1940s, there's still people living up here and they were mining, even right through the 1940s, especially the Depression, 1930s. The mines were still open and working. So note the peculiar meandering road that we've got up here. It's very distinctive and it helps us to orientate ourselves through the next maps and things I'm going to show you. This was the Caledonian at the back and the Golden Crown in the front. So I was telling you about the gold mine experience. That's sitting right there on that land. You can see where they've just thrown their mine waste over the side. They actually had steam pumps and things up the top for their winding up the shafts. And this was the hive of activity, at least up until 1872. It's the heyday of this mine was 1871, when it was the biggest producing mine in New Zealand, if not Australasia. And it was only taken over in that spot by the Waihi mine some years later. So this is the Waiatahi again, or Waiatai. If any locals are listening, they'll call it the Waiatai. And you can see the meandering creek. We're talking here about 1868, bottom of the Waiatai Creek, and look at the mines, the claims. Each one would be roughly 200 meters long, and there would be 5 or 6 miners working on each one as the owners. They would have their tunnels and their shafts and their tracks, and just like what we were looking at on the other side of town. By the way, we started off at Karaka, which is somewhat to the right of this, quite a long way at the other end of town. Here we have the most famous mine of them all, Caledonia, and the same reef went through into the Golden Crown. It was what they called the shot of gold. But all of these mines were very rich. This is Mulligan's, very rich. And the mines didn't stop just at the coastline. They went up just as thickly all the way up. And the men, all these claim holders were getting living wage, better than living wage, out of these mines. Well, they'd never have stuck to it. And even two big claims like this one, the Golden Age and the Harp of Erin, somebody came along and found out that the Harp of Erin had too much land. They measured it, and the gold warden had to come and tell them that they've taken out too much land in their claim. And so the guy who had made this court action against the Harp of Erin got the claim in between. Tiny little claim, just one man worked on that. But he won that land in the Warden's Court at Thames. There was a gold warden who took care of all these issues, disputes between miners, claim jumping, all kinds of stuff was going on that if it wasn't for the gold warden, probably war would have broken out most of the time. So we have batteries going all the way up here. In fact, this track, Waiatahi track, goes all the way up to Punga Flat, about 10 miles up, batteries all the way along. So they had to carry all of that by horse and cart. So not only did they find gold up in the hills, but they also found it under the town in the end. This is Grahamstown, the far end of Thames, northern end of Thames. But there was all the way up against the ranges, they found gold under the town. But of course they couldn't, there was no hill there, so they couldn't go into the side of the, like I was showing you before, they had to go down with a shaft. And that needed a poppet, winding apparatus, probably somewhere there'll be a steam engine, and also probably there is something to get the miners up and down the shaft and bring the quartz up. So that was what life was like in Grahamstown. In the early days, you never knew from one day to the next if you're going to be actually in a mine practically, because these are family houses all the way along here, businesses. This is a pub in the background here. So once more, that all had to be worked out in the Warden's Court. So just to have a quick look at the way the streams are laid out, we've got the Waiatahi here with its meandering circle again, but it goes way up into the hills. And up the top is Panga Flat, which was an important mining town that actually was all the way up there. Then we've got the Moanataiari stream, and in between these two was the all-important Caledonian mine. So that's where the gold was actually centred, and all the rest just got the leftovers that didn't end up in the Caledonian mine. And then we've got the Kiranui here, and Kiranui was quite famous, quite good. In fact, it was the first mine called the Shotover, was right here. They found gold here. I'll show you in a minute. And it was what advertised Thames as the place to go for gold. It was the first one. Tauru Road goes further up, and a lot of gold up there as well. This is just some of the gold, some of the claims. So you can see that it's not just the other creeks. The Moanataiari is big on claims with the Golden Crown and the Caledonian. Everybody wanted a claim that was close into them, but it's solid claims all the way. This is an aerial view of it again. Waiotahi here, but they were right up in these hills. That's where Panga Flat was, way up there. There were some very important mines on this flat up here and further over here. So they were gradually working their way back. But Panga Flat was really the extent of it. It didn't go back any further than that. So just another, I'm talking a lot about Caledonian because it was practically solid gold, or 50-50 gold, that hill. The shot of gold, as they call it, started over here in the Manukau when it was first discovered. They pretty quickly discovered that the shot of gold was heading on to the next door claim, which happened to be the Golden Crown. And they followed it, made their fortune, and then the Caledonians stepped in and they had the lot. And that went deep. So that's only the profile from the top. It went deep down, and the owners of that mine, well, they made their fortunes, literally. This is the original Golden Crown stamping battery. So we've got Caledonians way up here on the top of the hill. And this battery today is, although it's not like that anymore, there's a new one being built, a replica, and you can visit it. It's called Gold Mine Experience. Don't miss it if you're interested in gold. The Golden Crown claim, I just want to mention that they did the same outfit, same way. They had their shot of gold, which went deep. They had their quartz going into the battery, so they had to go upwards and hollow it out, bring it down, and then they went up to the next level, which in fact had an entrance on the side of the hill. They just kept on going up. They hollowed this all out. So those hills we were just looking at in those aerial views are hollow. They went down further. There's still plenty of lode there. Gold was still there, was just as wide, but the water entered. They tried with, I told you, they had this big public pump. It's called Bella Street Pump House. That's another place you can visit. It was much later, but the idea of building it was to try to get this water out of these mines because there was still gold further down. In the end, they struggled on for some years, but it didn't work. So they had to stop because of the water. They didn't stop because the gold ran out. This is another mine that was built in the about 1910 or so, the Moanataiari mine. It was a consolidation of all the mines that I just showed you, all the claims. They bought them all out and made this one big mine. All the claim holders mostly kept their interest in that, so they were still receiving dividends on what this mine did. It went underground and out with tunnels. long tunnels going right through all these hills to the old claims and finishing out the bottom of them. Because now they had steam engine pumps, they were able to get a little bit lower than the old miners had been able to do with no pumps. Now you can see here, they've got a steam engine here. They've got a big shaft pop up, another one here. So they're very much organised and can go much lower. So the old miners were going down about 3 levels. This mine went down, you know, a good 10 or more. There were other consolidation mines also around the town. This is the base of the Moanataiari. So we've been looking at Caledonia, and it's up the top of this hill here. This was the watering hole. So really the miners relied on these hotels, not necessarily for drinking, although of course that was a big part of it, but for conversation. This was where the miners learned how to mine. This is where they learned all the tricks. But most of them, the first arrived, didn't know anything about quartz mining. Even those experienced miners from the South Island, and there were piles of them, came up here, didn't know anything about quartz reef mining. They soon had to find out. They found it out in these pubs, of which there were, I don't know, upwards of 100, even up the creeks. There were pubs up there. And also they were living in tents or mean looking huts. This was the only place where they could come down, sit in a comfortable chair by a fire in the winter. And so, of course, they loved to come down to the pubs. Of course, the beer was there as well. And that was another advantage. And they call it the barman's claim. The claim of the hotel owner was considered to be the richest claim of the lot. So he was able to make good money, didn't need to go up into the hills and dig around. He could just open a bar like this, and he'd made his fortune. A butcher was right next door. Inevitably, there was a butcher. Not so many grocery stores. They had those because they needed to get their tobacco from there. But yes, there was always a butcher on the corner, so they could come down, have a drink, grab a slice of meat for tomorrow, take it up into the hills and barbecue it on their campfire. That was the life of a miner. This is the Moanataiari. There was quite a lot of batteries up here. This is the earliest one, the Victoria battery. Now these roads were handmade by the miners themselves. You can see it's handmade, very beautifully made. And they never put gravel on it. I mean, they had all this mine waste all over the place, but they never put it on. So inevitably in the winter, it all turned to mud, especially with the wheels of the cart grinding into it and stirring it up. So everything came to a halt in the winter when this all turned to mud. So that was about 2 months of the year, June and July, when things had to stop. The rest of the time, they were carting their quartz to the nearest battery. And there were batteries all over. You can see here another chute coming down the hill to bring their quartz down to this. There's a little mine wagon loaded into that wagon and into the back of the battery. After a while, the government realised that they had been neglecting the miners. They'd been taking the taxes and the gold duty and everything, but it was all staying in Wellington and not coming back. And the miners were having to build bridges, roads, footpaths in town. Everything was being made by the miners themselves. And of course, there was a lot of complaint to the government. Eventually, they realised in about 1870 they had to do something. So they came up and they built these tramways all the way up all the creeks. It turned out it was a little too late, but because the miners had already struggled for years without it. And they'd sort of set up their systems, but you know, ones that were close to the tramway could get their quartz in. Here you can see they're bringing their quartz across, probably because it needed to be loaded on the side. And they were able to use the tramway to get stamping batteries further up into the hills, and that was a big advantage. The thing being, though, that it was such a steep, everything was also steep. They couldn't do it with just one tramway. they had to just do a tramway along a flat, and then they would stop, and they would have to lift the quartz up to the next level and then take it across. So it wasn't a continuous tramway all the way up the hills, and a lot of them thought it was more of a nuisance than it was worth. Well, a lot of them used it as well. So I think the smaller miners used it. The big mines had already set themselves up with their own batteries and their own tramways, so it wasn't much use to them by then. Come back out again with another one of these 1940 aerial views before the hills were covered in regrowth like they are now. But you can see where they were. This is Punga Flat, lots of claims, lots of gold. Up here, this flat up here was a very important mine, or cluster of mines. So I'd say basically what we're looking at here is all hollowed out. And they didn't ever fill it in either, by the way. Now we're going right to the far left of that last photo to Kuranui. The first mine ever was built here was that ever found really good gold was the Shotover, sometimes called Hunt's claim. And they had a battery. And they were the ones who sent out the good news there was gold at Thames. So it's very famous because of that. And this is the Shotover claim. And this is taken right back in 1867. But the funny thing about the Shotover was that it wasn't underground. Every single other mine in the whole of Thames was underground. This one just had the quartz reef sitting on the surface. This used to be a waterfall. And all they had to do, in this case, instead of burrowing down to get the gold, was just to chip it off. That's what these guys are doing. You can see they've got picks and shovels. These are a wheelbarrow, because this is very early on. They're chipping the rock off, load it on a wheelbarrow, take it across here on this walkway, all health and safety conscious, of course. Then they tip the quartz into this chute, down the chute, onto here, and then it has to be loaded into yet another wheelbarrow. Here's a wheelbarrow full already, and take it to their battery, which was only a very small battery at the start. Gradually, over the next year or so, they built a bigger one. These are the rich guys who hunt, and one of the others here in the front with the good clothes on. They made their fortune, but within a year or so, it was all played out. This didn't turn out to be very big. It was very rich, practically 50% gold in many cases. But it all played out, and Hunt and all he had three mates. The four of them practically spent their money by the end of the 1870s. So short-lived. And this is it today, with me standing, doing a little bit of mining myself. But this is what's left of that cliff. And of course, in later years, they burrowed in under it looking, but there was nothing there much. Now, you can't read all of this, but I just want you to be able to see the extent of all of the claims in this area. We're only talking about Waitahi, Moanataiari and Kuranui. All of those squares are mines, and they go way up, right up here into Punga Flat. And actually, I've not done, this is the beginning of Karaka Creek, which is even further out. I haven't shown you that part, but these backcountry mines, some of them were very rich too. Struggle, and as you can see in this area, they've all got their own batteries. Each of those red dots is a battery. And this battery here, there was one up at Punga Flat as well. But I'm just going to show, I'll be talking about this one in a minute. This is it, Albernia. This Albernia mine and the Cambria mine, they were still going in the 1920s, making a living out there. So it's way, way up. Back down to the coast again. This is the Long Drive. That was a famous claim because it was owned by royalty. One of the claim holders anyway was the Duke of Edinburgh, the first Duke of Edinburgh, the son of Queen Victoria. He had a share in that claim, so that's famous. They've got a steam engine running their battery. I'm nearly finished. This is Kuranui again, another hole up there. You can see they've been throwing their stuff out. This is the battery. They've got to get it down to here. And this is the far end of Kuranui, the Kuranui Hotel. There's a battery here. A lot of very valuable mines up here. They had to get their quartz down the chute into the battery, which is in behind you. You can't see it. Okay, so I just want to mention to those of you who think they might have miners in their family that were working in New Zealand. I've got this database. It's online. It's free at that website, kaelewis.com. There's 85,000 records of gold miners in New Zealand. They come from, I've done the records for Otago, West Coast and Thames, only for these years, 1861 to 1872. So if they were mining later than that, there's no good looking in here. But you never know, they might have been here right at the beginning. And this will tell you if they were here at the beginning. And you can actually filter by district. So make use of that. And this whole talk has been a quick summary of my book. And if you're interested in buying that book, go to the same website that tells you where you can get a copy if you want one. And you can see right on the cover, you recognize it now, the shot over mine being chipped off from the surface. So that's my talk.